Well, it's been a little while, but we are back with another edition of our Klub Outside Q&A Roundup series. As always, Kubo takes and answers a variety of questions directly from fans over on his personal Q&A platform, and then we try to dissect those answers and see if there's anything of value to be found there. Now, a lot of the time, Kubo's comments are a mix of light-hearted chatter and fluff, but sometimes we are given real, genuine insight into the story and world of Bleach that, for whatever reason, simply wasn't found in the original material. And as always, I'm not looking at every single answer he's ever given, nor even necessarily looking at them in chronological order. Mostly I'm trying to curate the answers that I find to be interesting, and as we haven't posted one of these while the anime has been out for the last few weeks, a couple of intriguing responses have cropped up from Kubo in that time. And so, speaking of which, this time the questions revolve around Urahara and Aizen's potential history, the reality of how Yhwach's Auswählen works, why some Quincy techniques are in Japanese, and more. As always, a huge thank you goes out to M Shadows for providing the translations to the questions and answers. There's a link in the description to where you too can go to find them, so make sure to check them out. Right, on with the latest roundup. We'll begin with the topic of Urahara and Aizen, as Kubo dropped a small tease regarding their relationship. However, before we get started, just to let you know, there will be some spoilers for the future of the 1000-Year Blood War arc for parts of the story still yet to come in the anime, so make sure you're aware of that. And when you're done with this video, if you enjoyed it and you want to see more from me and the channel, you want to stay up to date, especially while the 1000-Year Blood War arc part 3 is airing, then make sure to hit the subscribe button down below, as it really does help the channel out, and I really do appreciate it. So, first up, we are taking a trip back in time to one of Bleach's best crafted stories, the Turn Back the Pendulum arc, to investigate the potentially shared history between two of the story's greatest minds, Kisuke Urahara and Sosuke Aizen. Depicted in Bleach as eternal rival chess masters, both Kisuke and Aizen play an enormous role in steering both the story and Ichigo to their destined conclusion. In Turn Back the Pendulum, Kisuke is promoted to the position of captain and begins transforming the 12th Division into what we know it to be today, a division of science and experimentation, also founding the Research and Development Institute to help bolster that connection. At the same time, Aizen is busy running tests of his own in secret. It's the early days of his holification experiments, where they are struggling to even maintain a Konpaku's form after forcibly holofying them. These two characters, who are famed for breaking the boundaries of what's possible, often by discarding the notion of ethics entirely, are on what feels like an inevitable collision course. But is there a chance that they already knew of each other before that fateful meeting 110 years ago? It sounds a little far-fetched to me, but one reader believes there might be a chance, and that Kubo potentially dropped a hint regarding this idea in the very first chapter of the Turn Back the Pendulum flashback arc. Now, to be fair, before we take a look at their question, Aizen's past is essentially a complete mystery. And when it comes to Kisuke, well, we know a bit more, but we don't know an awful lot either. Both characters are purposefully obfuscated, though I suspect we might learn a little more about Kisuke in the coming future, but I'll talk about that in a bit. Anyway, the reader asked Kubo a question about their potential shared history, which reads as follows. In the Turn Back the Pendulum arc, during Urahara's promotion to captain rank, Hirako says that a real slacker's shown up. However, since Aizen's reply seemed a little deeper, could it be that Aizen has had him in his sights since before he was even made a captain? Did Urahara already make a name for himself by that point through some kind of research, or were they classmates during the academy days? Well, it's certainly an interesting question, and they are absolutely touching upon a subject that I think people, generally speaking, would love to know more about. The scene in question occurs at the end of the first chapter of the Turn Back the Pendulum arc. As the captains gather for Kisuke's promotion ceremony, Kisuke himself is the last to arrive, appearing at the doors in a comedic fashion. Nervously laughing about the fact he's late, Kisuke stands awkwardly at the entrance while Shinji, observing from the sidelines, muses that Kisuke appears to be a slacker. Standing behind him, Aizen agrees with his captain, but in an ominous final shot, the panel lingers on the villain's eye as though there is something going on beneath the surface. Now, most of the characters here will likely have never met Kisuke before this moment. The only ones who have are, of course, Yoruichi, but also Yamamoto and the other captains that oversaw Kisuke's proficiency exam. But apart from that, he should be a totally new entity, brought up from within Yoruichi's own division on her recommendation. Anyway, here's what Kubo had to say in response. It's a little surprising, but we'll get into that. Aizen had known Urahara since before he started getting involved with Yoruichi. I've got to be honest, I'm not sure how to feel about this answer. Like I said before, we know nothing about Aizen's past really, so I guess this is totally possible. Though again, this feels like a textbook example of Kubo just building off what the question itself posed. But in reality, I think it's much more interesting if they never met before Turn Back the Pendulum. I always took the final shot of that chapter to mean one of two things, or possibly both. That it was a little nod to the readers that of course these two will end up fierce enemies and competitors, but also perhaps that Aizen was maybe the only one to see through Kisuke's bumbling facade in that moment. That even if he didn't know anything about this man, Aizen suspected that there was a lot more to him than, as Shinji said, him simply being a slacker. And to me, this was always kind of confirmed naturally later on during the same mini-arc. While everyone else just underestimated Kisuke, in reality he was the only one who was able to see what Aizen was really up to the point where in an amazing moment Aizen acknowledges him. Aizen states that Kisuke is exactly the kind of man he thought he was. But regardless, that's not what Kubo has said here. Kubo notes that Aizen had known Urahara since before he started getting involved with Yoruichi. Again, the little information we have on either of these characters makes this difficult to really break down. Later in Turn Back the Pendulum, Tessai confronts Kisuke and hints that they both grew up in Yoruichi's mansion a long time ago, and unfortunately that's all we really know. I mentioned earlier that I think we will learn more about Kisuke's past in the future, and the reason for that is that Kubo once said he had already fully developed a flashback depicting Kisuke and Yoruichi's relationship, and that he wanted to show it. Considering it never happened in the source material, it seems like a certainty to me that it was meant to appear in Kisuke's final battle against Askin, but was likely cut for time or due to Kubo's declining health. This is further reinforced by the fact that the two prior battles against Schutzstaffel members feature extensive flashbacks for Kyoraku and Nanao, and for Mayuri and Nemu. So I'm fairly certain it will appear in some form or another during part 4 of the anime. Perhaps Aizen will even feature in it. But for Aizen to know Kisuke from before he started getting involved with Yoruichi seems completely absurd to me. The implication is that Kisuke and Yoruichi have been close friends since childhood. So, what, did Aizen grow up in Yoruichi's mansion too? Why is everyone growing up in the Shihoin mansion? The truth, therefore, is that while this is definitely an intriguing piece of information, there's really not a lot to go on here. For all we know, we'll discover the Aizen family served the Shihoin family or something, and that's where Aizen's hatred of being ruled over from on high comes from. A big issue for me is that the idea of Aizen knowing and possibly hating Kisuke from childhood feels very cliché, especially the notion of them even being classmates or something. And also, despite being a huge fan of Aizen myself, I don't feel like he needs to be injected into the story absolutely everywhere at all times. It's already enough that he is directly responsible for the creation of the Vizards and for Kisuke's exile, as well as indirectly responsible for the creation of Ichigo. I don't really want him to have anything to do with Kisuke and Yoruichi's earliest days, but it kind of seems like maybe he will. I think it's just this idea that Aizen knew of Kisuke before he got involved with Yoruichi that I find to be truly weird. To what extent did they know each other? And also, the question wonders if Kisuke made a name for himself through research prior to the Turn Back the Pendulum arc, but as far as we know, Kisuke wasn't really in the business of conducting scientific research during his tenure in the 2nd Division. Although even then, he knew of Mayuri thanks to his time as a warden in the Maggot's Nest, so I guess it's possible he was always tinkering around with something. We know, of course, that Kisuke creates the Hogyoku, but to be honest, I kind of figured that happened at some point during the time skip that occurs in Turn Back the Pendulum, the 9 years between 110 years ago and 101 years ago. Anyway, that's really all I have to say on this question right now. I guess, as was posed in the question itself, they could have known each other from their academy days, but even then, that still doesn't explain why Aizen knows Kisuke before even Yoruichi did. The only reasonable explanation I can think of is that perhaps Aizen and Kisuke joined the academy together, and then at some point during their time there, the Shihoin family took Kisuke in a similar way to how Rukia was adopted by the Kuchiki family. And perhaps Aizen was then curious about Kisuke ever since. I suppose it's possible that Kisuke and Yoruichi growing up together doesn't necessarily mean they were children at the time, but who knows? Let me know what you think about this one. It is definitely a little odd, and feels like a stretch to me, but either way, getting insight into the history of these two characters in particular is always going to be welcome. Up next, we have a question and answer pertaining to a subject that I've debated on this channel numerous times, and tried to figure out and wrap my head around to no avail as well. So to actually get something from Kubo himself was certainly refreshing. And that's how Yhwach's Auswählen actually works. Because as you're no doubt aware, the Auswählen itself appears to be on the surface extremely inconsistent in its portrayal. Let's briefly go over what we know about the Auswählen itself to lend some context to Kubo's upcoming answer. Yhwach has the ability to rob his Quincy followers of their power and either take it for himself or disperse it among other more deserving Quincies. Note that I said power there, and that's deliberate. The word power, as an actual piece of terminology, as a piece of jargon in Bleach, is relatively new, used specifically where Yhwach is concerned, because as Mayuri points out in a new scene from the anime, Yhwach isn't stripping Quincy's of Reishi or their Reryoku or anything like that, but the very power of their souls that is tied to their life force. When Yhwach used the Auswählen initially, he instantly robbed characters like Masaki and Katagiri of their Quincy powers, but they weren't killed on the spot. Masaki was defeated by Grand Fisher because she was suddenly left powerless, while Katagiri, who was already frail and ill, died 3 months after the fact. It's later revealed that all Quincy hit with the Auswählen develop a silver blood clot in their heart, meaning the Auswählen will inevitably kill all Quincy it is used on. But the immediate effect seems to vary greatly. So, Masaki was seemingly robbed of all of her powers, but remained alive, and were she not fighting Grand Fisher at the time, would presumably have been okay for the foreseeable future. Up next, we have the most recent Auswählen as of the anime. When Yhwach's Schutzstaffel are killed in the royal palace, he robs his Quincy followers still fighting in the Serete of their power and life force, deeming them unnecessary for the future battle. As of the anime and the manga, these are the characters affected. Basby is directly struck by the light, and while it seriously injures him, he survives with seemingly no lasting effects, including the fact that peculiarly he can still use his shrift perfectly. However, we can assume his Volsten dish has been stolen. Nanana is also struck by the light directly while incapacitated by Byakuya, indicating he was still alive at the time, but unconscious. In the manga, Nanana finds himself in an identical situation to Basby, injured but alive and able to use his shrift. In the anime, however, it seems like Nanana has been killed by the Auswählen off-screen, though we don't necessarily know that for sure yet. Candice and Meninus' fates are left unknown in the original manga. However, in the anime, both of them are hit by the light directly and presumably killed, as Kubo drew each of them a death art. But it's not quite as simple as that, as we know the Bambis survive the war in full, unless Kubo is dramatically changing that. Then there's Robert, whose fate isn't shown in the anime at all, despite his being the most explicit in the manga. Upon being struck directly by the light in the original chapter, Robert's flesh is torn from his bones, killing him instantly and taking all of his power and life. Meanwhile, Lil Toto, acting quickly, manages to avoid the light, saving Giselle at the same time. However, despite them avoiding Auswählen, both of them are robbed of their holy forms, the power still drained by the light itself. And as well in the anime, we also see numerous Soldat-level Quincy being hit by the Auswählen too, and it seems like each of them is killed in a fashion similar to Robert. Okay, so that's what becomes of every sternritter hit in the anime to date, and we can see that even in the anime there are still some inconsistencies. Basby was clearly hit by the light and for a sustained period of time as well, yet has been shown to have survived, while neither Nanana, Candice or Meninas have yet returned. Meanwhile, Robert's fate appears to have been completely off-screened entirely. Now, I want to reiterate that it is absolutely still within the realm of possibility that one or more of these characters could show up in the next few episodes, but Kubo has drawn a death art for each of them, so it's unclear. Anyway, with that context laid out, here is the question posed to Kubo. Regarding the Auswählen performed in the later part of the story, the Bambis and Basby still retain their shrifts, and there is no sign of them having lost their powers. Taking into consideration that they are part of the younger generation, is it safe to say that they survived due to the Auswählen targeting old Quincy's first and having already taken the necessary amount of power that was needed at the time? Okay, a good question and a fair assessment, I think. Before I say anything else, let's have a look at Kubo's answer, which reads, "The necessary amount of power is taken from old and weakened Quincy's in that order. Also, Basby and the girls are young, and their abilities are also high level, therefore their protection against Auswählen is also naturally high, which resulted in them only having their powers reduced." Okay, so a remarkably detailed answer from Kubo, which is nice, some of which makes sense on a surface level. The idea that Auswählen takes the majority of power needed at the time from old and then weakened Quincy's first does actually make quite a lot of sense. Robert was clearly one of the oldest Quincy's and had been weakened from his battle with Byakuya, so he was essentially completely doomed. The Auswählen was going to strip him of literally everything he had and then move on. In that sense, even among the unnecessary sternritter, Yhwach is still making sure he spares his capable fighters as much as possible, which, is actually smart. But there are some things here that don't really wash. For example, is Basby really considered young? The ages of the sternritter is a prickly topic, but we actually know for a fact that Basby was around 1,000 years ago, meaning he is really about as old as it gets. He doesn't really look it, but that's likely because the sternritters stopped aging normally once they began hiding out in the Serete and became spirits. Let's also look at Candice and Meninas. So by Kubo's logic, we can expect them to have survived, I suppose. They're both young, and neither of them was really that weakened. Maybe Candice was pretty weak at the time as she took a beating from both Ichigo and Byakuya, but still. Nanana potentially dying also makes a little more sense as he was actively unconscious at the time. Also, Kubo talking about how high level certain sternritter abilities are as well is interesting. So the fire, the glutton, the zombie, the power, and the thunderbolt are all considered high level, whatever that means, by whatever metric that's being measured against, while the underbelly and Robert's unknown shrift presumably aren't. In my opinion, that is so nebulous that you can't really glean anything from it at all, to be totally honest. And then, of course, there is the question of the future. And, like I said earlier, spoilers for the remainder of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc here, But we know another Auswählen is performed towards the very end of the arc, and this opens up even more questions. Both Yhwach and Gerard are struck by the Auswählen on screen, and both of them suffer very different fates. Gerard is given the Robert treatment, and his flesh, which I guess is kind of just light at this point, is ripped right from his bones, killing him immediately. Yhwach, however, has his powers taken from him, but he collapses to the ground, able to speak with Uryu for a little bit before eventually just kind of passing away. Now, with this new context, perhaps it is a little bit clearer what happened here. We have no idea how old Gerard is, but he could potentially be ancient. And while his ability is absolutely high level, you could also argue that he had been seriously weakened at this time. After all, his physical body had just reformed after being totally annihilated by the captains. So yeah, I'm surprised, but maybe it does work. Maybe that's why the Auswählen targeted Gerard in such a brutal way. Yhwach is a little weirder. Again, like Basby, he is over 1,000 years old at this point, but unlike Basby, he dies right away, essentially, though with no visible injuries. But maybe this even makes a little more sense now. With far fewer targets to choose from, the Auswählen had to take more from the Quincy it could actually target, so maybe enough of Yhwach's life was drained to kill him, but Gerard took the bulk of the absorption first, with Yhwach partitioning the power needed out between the two of them. So this is very rudimentary, but in this instance, 100% of the power Yhwach needed to open a portal, 75% of that power came from Gerard, which resulted in him dying the way he did, and then the following 25% of that power came from Yhwach, which was enough to kill him, but not in such an immediate and gruesome way. I'm just theorising here, maybe that's how it works. I don't know, at this point it's all getting very granular, and who knows, that final Auswählen might not even appear in the anime. Regardless, an interesting response from Kubo, and it is good to at least have something to go off at last, but ultimately I think the Auswählen is just an inherently convoluted and inconsistent power. Our third topic today is a much simpler one, though still quite interesting. Each race in Bleach tends to have a language motif that then goes on to form the foundation for their individual abilities. The Shinigami are of course Japanese, the Arrancar are Spanish, the Fullbringers are English, and the Quincy have historically been German. And while that's mostly remained true even throughout the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, with new terminology like Volstendish, Blut, Soldat, Daten, and more, there are a few notable instances where that isn't the case, generally where Uryu himself is involved, but there are also some universal terms that we'll get to in a minute. Now again, where Uryu is concerned, he uses multiple German language words in his arsenal. His signature move is Lichtregen after all, but the original names for his bow were in Japanese, Kojaku and Ginrei Kojaku to be precise, therefore breaking that convention in a fairly big way. Well, someone decided to ask Kubo about it with a question that reads, are names such as Kojaku and Ginrei Kojaku passed down within the Ishida family? Or did Uryu come up with them? And Kubo responded as such, saying, the names come from documents regarding Japanese Quincy's, which are found in the Ishida family. So, a fairly simple answer to a fairly simple question, but I do quite like it. The sternritter do appear to be quite multinational, so it makes sense that Quincy's were found all across the world at some point, and I like the implication that Quincy's from different countries kept documents pertaining to their creations or their discoveries as well. It makes the race feel a lot bigger and deeper than what we get to see, and that's really cool. I guess the only thing about this particular answer that I'm not 100% sure about is when Kubo says which are found in the Ishida family, is he referring to the documents regarding Japanese Quincy's or Japanese Quincy specifically? Because obviously the Ishida family is Japanese, so that makes sense. But what I'm getting at is, are these documents in question specifically written by the Ishida family? If that is the case, then I guess technically the names that Uryu has taken for his bows are passed down to him in a sense. That being said, there are some pretty big, notable exceptions to this entire rule. Blanket, universal Quincy terms that I don't think were ever given an actual German name, making their terminology feel a little less consistent overall. For example, Ranso Tengai is a major Quincy ability, the power to use reishi threads to control their own broken bodies like a puppet in order to keep fighting well beyond their physical limit, and it was never given a German name. The same goes for Hirenkyaku, a Quincy's own high-speed movement technique similar to Shunpo or Sonido, which of course have their own respective names that fit within their language motifs. It's totally possible that if Uryu is more accustomed to using Japanese names for certain techniques, then we've just never heard the German variation. But another odd one is Jinto, which is basically a Quincy's version of Kido, and that should theoretically just be the blanket term for that once again, especially considering some of the names of Jinto, in fact all of them I think, do appear to be German. And our final topic today is, as we usually do, a slightly more light-hearted one. People often talk about how beautiful a lot of the Bleach cast actually is, so it was funny to see someone actually get Kubo's perspective on this, with one reader asking the question, is there any male character from Bleach media, out of the Living World, Soul Society, Waco Mundo, or among the Quincy's, that you think is the most handsome, or that you consciously draw in a way that would be considered handsome? It's a funny question, and Kubo's got a good answer for it too, saying, Hitsugaya, Byakuya, Xyloporo, and Hashwolf. All of them fit the beautiful character archetype, so I draw them accordingly. Hashwolf is definitely the least surprising answer out of the four given here. The character practically looks like he was designed to be a hair model or something. Byakuya too makes a lot of sense, and Hitsugaya is even explicitly called beautiful by Charlotte Coolhorn at one point in the story. Xyloporo is perhaps the most unexpected answer on this list. I wouldn't have thought he was part of the beautiful character archetype, to be honest, but there you go. I mean, Kubo clearly loves the character, probably more than he loves any of the other three he just mentioned, so perhaps it's not too surprising to see after all. Alright everyone, but that's it for today's video. That's it for the latest edition of our Klub Outside Q&A Roundup series. As always, I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you took some value away from it as well. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought of the video's topics today. Which one did you find to be the most interesting, and which one did you get the most out of? Was it the small hint, the small tease regarding the potentially shared history between Kisuke and Aizen? Was it finally getting some kind of concrete explanation for how the Auswählen works and how it targets its victims? Maybe it was the answer surrounding Japanese Quincy ability names, or perhaps you liked knowing about who Kubo felt his most handsome male characters are. Either way, do let me know down in the comments below. And as always, I want to end the video by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, without who I simply wouldn't be able to keep doing this. If you like what I do here over on YouTube and you also want to support for me another step further, thank you. By supporting me at the $1 tier a month, you can get your name in the credits of every single video just like this, and at the $2 tier or higher, you can get every single video I release absolutely free of baked-in YouTube ads. Alright guys, thank you so very much for watching once again. I'll see you tomorrow for the live reaction to the 1000 Year Blood War Arc episode 30, and until then I'll catch you later. And I'll see you then.